In the winter of 1903, a French military surveying team crossed into the central Sahara from the north and did not return on schedule. They had been given a standard commission, the kind of assignment that colonial cartographic offices issued routinely in that era to extend the existing survey grid southward into territory that the official maps still marked as unmeasured. They carried theodolites, plane tables, chain measures, and the standard documentation kit of a professional survey team. They were not archaeologists, they were not historians, they were engineers with instruments, tasked with producing accurate coordinates and reliable contour lines for terrain that France was in the process of administratively absorbing. What they were not tasked with, and what nothing in their commission had prepared them for, was the possibility that the terrain they were measuring was not empty, not geologically, not archaeologically, in a way that none of the standard categories of either discipline was designed to describe. They returned 3 weeks late. The team leader filed his report in Algiers in February of 1904. The report was received, logged, and within 6 months had been removed from the accessible archive. The survey maps produced during the expedition, the physical drawings on which the team had recorded their measurements, were collected from the team members individually before they left Algiers. The junior members were told this was standard procedure for materials of strategic cartographic value. The team leader was told something different in a private meeting whose contents he described once in a letter to his brother that survived because the brother kept it, and because the brother's granddaughter found it in a box in Lyon in 1987 and understood, just barely, what it contained. The letter is the thread. Everything that follows it either supports the thread or is silent around it, and the silence is itself a kind of support. If you have been following the evidence that the Sahara was not always desert, subscribe now, because this channel follows exactly that evidence, document by document, into the places the official maps refuse to mark. To understand what the 1903 team found, you have to understand what the Sahara looked like to European science at the turn of the 20th century. The desert was old. That was the consensus. It had been dry and hostile and empty for thousands of years, its nomadic cultures adapted to conditions that predated any civilization the word was then understood to imply. This picture was not dishonest, but it had edges the science preferred not to examine. There were dry riverbeds implying former water volumes no current climate model could account for. There were rock art sites depicting animals that required lush savanna to survive. There were geological formations that looked, to anyone who had spent time elsewhere, less like natural weathering and more like the aftermath of something that had stood on the surface for a long time and been buried. The 1903 survey team had no reason to look at any of this, until the terrain made it impossible not to. The letter describes the discovery in the way that a trained engineer describes something his instruments can measure, but his education cannot explain. There was a moment, the team leader wrote, when the chain measure came up short. They were measuring a flat section of hard-packed desert floor, running a baseline for the next survey grid, and the chain came up short because the surface it was measuring was not sand over rock. It was sand over cut stone, flat cut stone, level and continuous and extending when they began to probe along its edge with iron rods in both directions for a distance that took them the better part of a day to trace. The stone was deep enough that the sand had fully settled over it. In most places it sat under between 1 and 3 meters of compacted desert floor. But it was there, and it was level, and it was cut, and when they dug trial holes at intervals they found that it was not a single slab or a short run of natural formation. It was a surface, a prepared surface, running in a direction, maintaining a consistent width, and composed of stone that had been dressed in a way that no natural geological process produces. They were surveyors. They did what surveyors do. They measured it, they ran their chain along the direction of the formation, and they recorded the measurements and they marked the positions on their plane table sheets. The team leader's letter says they followed the formation for 2 days before the logistics of water and resupply required them to stop. In those 2 days they measured, in the team leader's own words, more than 60 kilometers of continuous prepared surface. 60 kilometers of dressed stone floor under the Sahara, running in a line, maintaining its dimensions, beginning somewhere behind them and ending somewhere ahead that they did not reach. FE. The team also found walls, not the foundation surface alone. Perpendicular to it, at intervals the team leader described as regular, though he did not give a precise spacing, there were upright stone elements running down from the surface into the substrate. He called them walls in the letter because that is what they looked like when the sand was cleared from around them. Not retaining walls, not revetments, not any of the functional underground masonry that an engineer might expect to find associated with a drainage or irrigation system. Walls. Vertical, dressed, continuous, running down from the level floor surface into the earth below it, as if they were the sides of rooms whose ceilings were the prepared floor and whose lower extent had not been excavated. The team dug 2 full trial trenches. Both showed the same configuration, floor above, walls descending below, and a depth to which the walls continued that their equipment was not able to fully measure before the trench walls became unstable and the dig had to be abandoned for safety. In the second trench they reached a point, at roughly 4 meters below the prepared floor, where one wall face was interrupted by an opening. An arched opening, not a crack, not a collapse, not a natural void in the masonry. An arch, cut, intentional. Leading into a space they could not see the end of because the darkness inside it was complete, and their lamp, lowered on a cord, showed only more dressed stone continuing inward and downward before the lamp's reach gave out. This is what was in the survey report that was logged in Algiers in 1904 and removed from the accessible archive within 6 months. The team leader's letter confirms the contents because he summarizes them in writing to his brother and expresses frustration that what he filed was an accurate professional document, and that the response was not the scientific investigation he expected, but a quiet administrative action he had not been prepared for. He writes that when the maps were collected from the team members, the officer who collected them did not offer the same explanation to everyone. To the team leader himself, in a private meeting, a different framing was offered. The officer told him that the materials were being held pending review because the findings, if published, would create administrative difficulties in territories France was still pacifying. The argument was colonial and practical. A report describing ancient large-scale construction under the Sahara would complicate the narrative that the territory was empty land being brought into civilization for the first time. The team leader accepted this framing in the meeting. In the letter to his brother, written several weeks later, he said he was not sure he believed it. He had reason to doubt, because the administrative difficulty explanation does not fully account for the speed and completeness of the removal. Survey reports were regularly suppressed or delayed for political reasons in that era, held back from publication, restricted to internal circulation. But they were not physically collected, sheet by sheet, from the hands of the men who produced them. The plain table sheets were the primary record. They were irreplaceable originals. Taking them was not administrative caution. It was erasure of the primary source, and erasure implies that the primary source contained something beyond a political inconvenience. A political inconvenience you delay. A primary source you erase when the thing it documents cannot be allowed to have an official existence at all. The Tartaria researcher arrives at this document with a frame assembled from years of working the same pattern across different continents and centuries. The pattern is consistent. A survey team, a military party, a construction crew, or a mining operation breaks into something that should not be there. The something is architectural. It is large. It is precise. It predates the civilization that found it. By an interval, the finding civilization's own timeline cannot accommodate. The initial report is specific and professional. The report is then suppressed, collected, reclassified, or lost in a way too consistent to be random. And the men who made the discovery spend the rest of their careers in a careful silence maintained not by threat, but by the simpler pressure of professional belonging. The understanding that a man who keeps talking about the wrong things stops being invited to the table where the right things are discussed. What the 1903 team found under the Sahara fits this pattern with a precision difficult to attribute to coincidence. Because the Central Sahara is not in the Tartaria framework, an empty space on an old map. It is the interior of a continent whose northern and coastal regions appear in the pre-reset cartographic record with a density of place names and a specificity of geography that implies sustained habitation and active trade across territories the standard story treats as wilderness. Grand Tartary, as the old maps named the Great Eastern Civilization, had a western edge that has been debated. But the northern African interior, in several of the maps the Tartaria researcher returns to most often, shows characteristics inconsistent with uninhabited desert. They are consistent with a geography that was known, trafficked, and built upon, and then became unknown, empty, and officially prehistoric in the transition between the world the old maps recorded and the world the new maps authorized. A prepared stone surface running for 40 miles under the central Sahara is not a prehistoric thing in the usual sense. Prehistoric means before the written record. But the Tartaria argument is precisely that the written record was edited, that the boundary between what counts as history and what gets classified as geology was drawn deliberately. A floor that long and a wall system that extensive under sand that geologists now know accumulated over centuries rather than millennia, is not the relic of a people who did not write. It is the relic of a people whose writing, along with everything else they left above the surface, did not survive the event that buried them. The Green Sahara, the period of wet and habitable climate across northern Africa that modern paleoclimatology now fully accepts, ended far more recently than the science of 1903 believed possible. A civilization that existed during the Green Sahara, that built at the scale the survey team measured, would have left exactly the kind of evidence the team found, exactly the kind that was immediately collected and made officially invisible. The letter in Lion is not a primary source. It is a summary of a primary source written by the man who produced it, describing what it contained and what was done with it. The chain of transmission is long and the opportunities for distortion are real and have to be acknowledged. But the letter also contains details that a fabrication would not need and are difficult to account for except as genuine memory. The team leader describes the temperature of the air that came out of the arched opening in the second trench as warmer than the ambient desert air at that depth. He notes it almost as an aside, the way a man notes something unexpected that did not fit the main story he was trying to tell. Warmth underground, warmth from an enclosed architectural space. The same detail the Pennsylvania foreman noted in 1952. The same detail that keeps appearing in accounts that have no documented connection to each other and no common source beyond the thing they are describing. The maps from the 1903 expedition have not been found in any archive that has been made publicly accessible. The original survey sheets, the plane table drawings that recorded the 60 kilometers of measured formation, remain wherever the officer in Algiers placed them in the spring of 1904. The secondary archive, the filed report, is absent from the holdings that French colonial cartographic records were transferred into after decolonization. The letter is in Lyon, in a private family archive, and its existence is known to a small number of researchers who have handled it or been given reliable accounts of its contents. It has not been published, it has not been digitized, it is paper in a box in a city, waiting for the kind of attention that changes what a document means. 40 miles of buried foundations under the Sahara is not a local anomaly. It is the scale of a city. It is the scale of a civilization's infrastructure, the roads and platforms and prepared surfaces that a large and organized society produces when it has been building in one place for a very long time. It is the scale of something that should be in the history books, not because the history books are required to explain it, but because they are required to acknowledge what the instruments found. The instruments found it in 1903. The report said so. The maps showed it. And then the maps were taken, one sheet at a time, from the hands of the men who drew them, and the archive absorbed the report and closed around it, and the desert went back to being empty in the way that only a managed silence can make a place truly empty. Stay with this channel. The maps that were taken are not the only maps, and not every archive is closed.